For the opening of the course, I just wanted to introduce some basic aspects of setting as an element of fiction. It seems like a simple thing, really, setting is, as the simple time and place of the story. You're trying to draw in all kinds of very particular dimensions of that time and place, though, as the story develops. And the writer's tension is always a balance between including enough detail to offer a sense of that setting in which the story takes place versus just feeding the reader too many physical details there. So you try to find a balance as a writer between exploring the particulars of a social, historical, or cultural moment, a particular neighborhood or space of a character's experience versus just overloading the reader with details. And so you can look at the stories that we're looking at in the class and kind of rethink how setting is a measure of that balance. It's interesting that in terms of writing about American experience, quite often that experience is much more an experience of displacement as opposed to the experience of place or a simple setting. And so how does displacement play a role in a description of setting? So you take stories like those by Junot Diaz, which are about being in one place or another, being picked up from one place and put down in another because of economic factors or cultural factors. And so displacement can be an aspect of the tensions of the setting within a story. Also, you can think about boundaries as an aspect of setting. How does a character cross a border or a boundary? And that can be a geographical border that the character crosses, or it could be a moral or cultural border. Sometimes you see that in Bonnie Jo Campbell's characters. When do they cross over a line from which they can't return? So kind of notice that within the stories as they develop. You can also think about the distinction between space and place here, right? That place is a defined location that's marked by particular landmarks, whereas space itself is more kind of undifferentiated or open. How does the writer think about place as a defining aspect of experience? Does it still matter where people come from? In both writers' cases here, both in Campbell and Diaz, does place make a difference in who characters understand themselves? One thing I'm always kind of interested in as a reader and writer is how urban space works as a setting, particularly because we experience urban space through a series of glimpses quite often. And if you know the graphic novelist Chris Ware, his work in things like Building Stories, a collection, how he thinks about urban experience coming through a series of windows. And if you've ever ridden Chicago's L downtown, you'll know that, you have these moments where you're riding the L and you turn a corner and you're looking directly into someone's window by chance, and you see into this life for a second, and then you're gone and you're on your way. So the city, for Ware and for some writers who write about city experiences, becomes kind of a collection of edges and corners, windows, fence lines, alleys, and vacant lots. These spaces that seem insignificant but are very significant in terms of urban experience. You can also think about other aspects of that urban experience here beyond glimpse. So how does urban experience offer a sense of anonymity? How does one blend into a city? And so setting can kind of pick up these aspects of urban experience, particularly when a character is thinking about a city in memory. So stories by like a writer by like James Joyce, in which memory is an important tension, where people who are older are remembering back to the city as they recall it, and the things that happened to them in a city that were significant to who they are today. Very simply, setting can be seen as the atmospherics of a story, right? What do you need as a writer to set the stage of a story? So you can think about the basic kinds of things that define the time and place of the story. What elements are essential to telling that space in terms of setting? Those can be physical details, or they can be a character's mental impressions of a space that get built as the character moves through a specific space. These, can include the kind of underlying social, historical, and economic factors that define the character's sense of displacement or the character sense of belonging to a space. And so these can kind of contribute towards the central conflict or the tension of a story. You can think here a lot about the setting of a Great Lakes story. So you take a writer like Bonnie Jo Campbell and think about how she's writing about the region of the Great Lakes as a setting. And you can think about all the kind of social, geographic, and economic aspects of the Great Lakes as a quote-unquote place. And these are, the writers will try to get into the realities of those aspects of place and how they define a character and a character's sense of being in the world, the tensions there that are economic or social or cultural or familial, and how a character, gets defined by displacement of being in a place like the Great Lakes. Where one thinks about its economic tensions, its cultural tensions, its personal tensions, and all the kinds of things that go with a sense of economic or ecological devastation here. Some really great writing about the Great Lakes has been done recently. A writer like Margot Jefferson, who in her great memoir Negroland thinks about spaces of migration of African American populations as they've moved into Chicago and Detroit, etc. Jefferson grew up on the south side of Chicago, and so she thinks about, how does that shift in place redefine one and one's story. You can also, like I say, think about the Great Lakes as a post-colonial space. In what ways does the space exist as a space of economic or ecological devastation? How does that setting impact Bonnie Jo Campbell's characters? One of the things that she's so brilliant with in her stories is that she's describing almost like what I like to say are like lives left behind. How do you live your life out when the empire has kind of passed through a space and people are trying to make do with what's left over in terms of work and family. So you can note that in Campbell's characters. Diaz's characters are kind of looking at that in a wider sense of what happens when people move through the Americas. How do their lives and senses of identity and language and self-definition change? Campbell's characters are in a much smaller space, but they still feel those same kind of root tensions in defining themselves. If you're interested in music and how this happens, great artists like Bob Dylan has almost kind of written his own novel of Duluth in the way that his ballads kind of detail a sense of American movement and change coming out of the Great Lakes. Dylan himself grew up in northern Minnesota, and so a lot of his ballads kind of reflect that sense of movement from that place and how it still defines him today. So setting is one of those central elements of fiction that we're going to look at various points of the course. Start to kind of detail your sense of how setting impacts the characters in the stories that we'll read, and we'll continue our discussion from there. Thanks.